Ah, the church. Be it pointy or round, or both, churches litter the landscape of Europe like cigarette butts on the side of the street. Smoking and praying are both things people still do nowadays, but we both know that they were much more popular in the past. So, if we focus on this incredibly original analogy I've come up with, comparing religion and addictive substances, we can see that much like a day in the life of an addict being governed by their substance of choice, the life of a deeply religious person is similarly policed by rituals and obligations. In fact, this ritual is the origin of our word religion. Religio in Latin doesn't refer to some personal belief, it means the actual practice of showing devotion. Although many today don't consider themselves religious in the modern sense of the word, the rituals of the West's dominant religion, Christianity, still defines the calendar of much of the world today. But 'twas not always so. There was actually once a time when the majority of Europeans practiced very different rituals and rites to the ones that we're familiar with today. Meet the pagans, the antagonists of today's story. Top 10 times that Christians were subject to official or unofficial persecution from a majority pagan empire in the 300 years from the death of Christ to the ascension of Constantine, the first Christian emperor. God, I'm gonna have to come up with a better title for that. But you get the idea. So without further ado, let's look at why Christians were persecuted, how it happened, and if it was really as bad as our stereotypical throw 'em to the lions view of it. So obviously we have to start the story of Christianity with the man himself, possible contender for the most influential individual who has ever lived, son of a god, the Emperor Augustus. Augustus loved religion. He was descended from Venus after all, and he looked over his huge empire and thought to himself, quite justifiably, it's obvious that a divine power is looking out for me. And so he sponsored a poet called Virgil to write a poem about how the gods had always intended Rome to have her empire, and now they were divinely protecting Augustus. Okay, said Virgil, but if I die before it's finished, you have to promise not to publish it. Virgil then died. Fuck his last wish, said Augustus. We now have an epic poem in Latin. So, massive oversimplification here, but what Augustus and his successors did was to redefine Roman faith so it could be the practice of a huge multicultural empire, not just a city-state. And the cornerstone of this transformation was incorporation. The Celts of Britain had a goddess called Sulis, looks a lot like the Roman goddess Minerva. Fuck it, same god. Oh, I'm sorry, is that a temple to the Hellenistic Egyptian deity Serapis that you have there in Alexandria? Looks more like Zeus Helioserapis to me. Of course some, like the Celtic Druids, weren't compatible with the Roman way of doing things. But that's fine. They were taken care of. So it's fine. But for the most part it was a matter of, oh, nice deity you have there. Just be sure that you sacrifice to Jupiter or some alternative version of him to keep the empire safe. Got it? Just swell. And faith, like belief, wasn't really as important as religio either. In today's church, it's kind of implied that if you don't actually believe in God, he takes it personally. But the Greco-Roman pantheon, materialistic bourgeois pigs that they are, don't care what you think of them, as long as that libation keeps coming. This is, remember, where the word religion, or religio, comes from. It means practice as opposed to faith. Rituals and the likes. To the Romans, that meant making a sacrifice. Anything from pouring a little wine on an altar, to butchering a full-grown bull in front of a crowd. So, with the relationship between Rome's empire and the gods now solidified, a display of religio for the sake of the empire and her leader was now a patriotic duty. Augustus wrapped all of this up by posthumously deifying his great-uncle/adoptive father, Julius Caesar. By making his dad a god, Augustus could start confidently calling himself the son of a god on the backs of his coins. Little did he know, in the middle of his reign, a child was born in Bethlehem, who would one day steal the title of son of God from Augustus. Jesus of Nazareth grew up in a very interesting time to live in the Roman province of Judea. Because of their monotheism and the respect that so many Romans had for Judaism, they were not forced to convert the Temple of Jerusalem into a shrine to Jupiter or anything. Not yet, at least. But this doesn't stop there being a somewhat rocky relationship between the Jews and their Roman overlords. The controversy in Judea between the Jewish elites, whose power derived from Roman rule, and those who believed that submitting to idolatrous Romans was a blasphemy against God, was one that Jesus would have grown up in the midst of. His vocal opposition to Roman rule, and his claim to be king of the Jews, lord of a kingdom greater than any on earth, would eventually land him in a little bit of trouble. It was a very bad time to be a threat to Roman rule in Judea. Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, was terrified of being purged by the increasingly paranoid emperor Tiberius. Quick explanation, Tiberius had only just foiled a plot by his praetorian prefect to overthrow him, and was very touchy about aristocrats who entertained any perceived treason at all. As a result, Pilate had begun a policy of brutal repression, to avoid being accused of allowing treachery to fester. So under normal circumstances, Jesus probably wouldn't have suffered a punishment as harsh as crucifixion, but he does, and history is forever changed as a result. Another incident ends up sealing the tyrannical governor's fate. When the Samaritans get their own Messiah, who promises to lead them into the desert to find the original commandments supposedly buried there by Moses, Pilate massacres the whole Samaritan community and incurs so much outrage for this that the governor of Syria has to come down from his province to remove him from office. Pilate then retires, probably out of disgrace. So I guess we can count Jesus as being the first Christian persecution by the Roman state. But to get to the next one, we're going to have to skip ahead about 35 years. Welcome to the reign of the Emperor Nero, and boy is it off to a rough start. The 26-year-old emperor has already killed his mum, and his wife, and now the whole city of Rome has just burned down. Nero wasn't too bothered though. The fire had killed a lot of people, and even more were left homeless, but that didn't matter. What mattered to Nero is that he now had plenty of space in the middle of the city to build a giant palace just for himself. Naturally, this whole "the fire was the best thing to ever happen to the city" attitude that Nero had adopted didn't really go over well with the mountains of grieving and homeless Romans who were watching him piss money away on self-serving vanity projects. Rumours even started saying that he had intentionally started the fire to clear the poor away and make room for his palace. What Nero needed was a scapegoat. How about those bizarre people who refused to sacrifice to the traditional gods? Yeah, the Christians. Let's blame them with their subversive Jewish beliefs and their strange cannibalistic tendencies. This doesn't really work, however. Tacitus, a Roman writer who grew up during Nero's reign, describes both the persecution and its effect. Despite the fact that he considers Christians to be depraved and that they were peddling a dangerous superstition, he also doesn't approve of the emperor's handling of them. Nero liked to crucify Christians, which is kind of thematic really, isn't it? He also enjoyed dressing them up in wild animal skins and then setting starving dogs on them. He would decorate the imperial gardens with candles made out of the corpses of Christians, and all of this struck the Roman people less as a punishment and more as the kind of thing that Hannibal Lecter would be into. As a result, according to Tacitus, the Roman people ended up feeling pity for the Christians being executed. They felt like this wasn't really being done for the empire's best interests, it was rather to fulfill Nero's sadistic desires. Here's a list of other things that Nero did in his reign that might support this hypothesis. This is also where Peter and Paul, the two big boy apostles to us Westerners, get put on the express freeway to heaven. Peter, never one to be outdone, insists on being crucified upside down to help ease the burden on merch departments for black metal bands. I know it sounds like Nero was pretty brutal, and he was, but he didn't exactly slow the growth of Christianity, nor did he manage to stamp it out in its infancy. There's no evidence that Nero's persecution ever left the capital of Rome. Peter and Paul are unlucky enough to be in the Eternal City at the time, but those in the provinces didn't suffer in the same way. It wasn't an empire-wide Christian hunt, more like a local publicity stunt that backfired. Once Nero's reign comes to an undignified end, the next 150 years is kind of chill. Okay, not technically. Domitian possibly executes a few high-profile Christians, but he'd execute fucking anybody towards the end of his reign. The Emperor Trajan actually gets a famous letter from Pliny the Younger, asking what to do about all the Christians in the province of Bithynia. The Emperor responds by telling Pliny not to bother looking for Christians actively, but wait only for them to be brought to him if they commit any kind of mischief. If they agree to sacrifice to the gods, release them. And this is basically how those in power dealt with Christians. No throwing to the lions, no proud Christians facing death fearlessly in defiance of an emperor determined to stamp them out. All of that comes much later. Imperial policy in the 1st and 2nd centuries after the death of Christ, with very few exceptions, was basically one of disdainful apathy. There are two reasons for this. Firstly, Christians weren't really getting to anyone important. In fact, it was often derided as a religion of slaves and women. Obviously, it makes sense that when Paul says something like, "There is neither man nor woman, slave nor free, all are one in Jesus Christ," those at the top of the social ladder would scoff at the thought, whilst those at the bottom might find it more appealing. As a result, the only Christians really to catch the eye of the authorities were ones in positions of power. And if so, they might be executed for atheism. In other words, failing to practice religio, their patriotic duty. The second reason comes to why bother? Remember that the problem with the Christian god wasn't that his name was something other than Jupiter or Apollo. The problem was that the followers of Christ refused to take part in religio for any gods other than their own, despite the fact that the empire's safety completely relied upon it. Celsus, a 2nd century philosopher who argued against the Christians, said that if everyone followed their doctrine, the emperor and the empire, which is intertwined with its pagan gods, would utterly collapse, and barbarians would be at the gates of Rome. Instead, Rome had her empire, by the favour of the gods, garnered through libation and sacrifice. Where is your god now, Mr. Christian? This god that is supposedly greater than all others, and yet has given you no kingdom of your own. This is all well and good, and allowed the Romans to turn a blind eye to Christians when the going was good. But what happens when the going wasn't good anymore? Well, that's where we are now, in the reign of Alexander Severus. The Christians in the 230s are actually having a pretty good time. Their numbers are up from the time of Nero, and they have some high-profile intellectuals on their side. They even have the support of the imperial household. Julia Mamaea, the mother of the emperor, although if we're being totally honest with ourselves, the actual emperor here, was a bit of a spiritual being. She wasn't a Christian, but she did invite such famous Christians as Origen of Alexandria to her court. She'd even let him talk to the young emperor about his ideas. What a world. It won't last though. The Roman army overthrows and kills Alexander and Julia in 235 CE. And that's the end of tolerance. It's time for our next big persecution. Well, I say big. It's small. The anti-Christian policies of the next emperor, Maximinus Thrax, are actually quite hard to pin down. Later Christians like to paint Alexander's reign as one of tolerance, compared to Maximinus's reign of terror, but the evidence doesn't really line up. High-profile Christians who were close to the imperial court weren't really arrested or anything. In fact, the short-lived period of Christian arrests in the 230s seems to have been carried out inconsistently and only in some provinces. Later Christian sources will point to the exile of Pope Pontian and his rival, Hippolytus of Rome, both of whom died as slaves in the mines of Sardinia, but this is maybe a tad disingenuous. Maximinus, the new emperor, was a hardline disciplinarian who'd lived his entire life in the army, and he was a brutal emperor, exacting draconian punishments on everyone. Remember that this is an emperor who will incite revolt in Italy through his brutal repression, and his harsh discipline within the army eventually turns his own loyal soldiers against him. Bearing this in mind, neither Pope Pontian nor Hippolytus were innocent of crimes outside of their faith. They were in fact bitter rivals over the title Bishop of Rome. Their followers were at each other's throats over both doctrine and which one of them had the right to lead the Christians of the city. It is entirely possible that Maximinus Thrax was not persecuting Christians per se, but just went after Christian leaders who he saw as dangerous rabble-rousers. The 240s, the decade after Maximinus is killed by his own soldiers, isn't a bad time to be a Christian at all. Philip the Arab, the emperor at this time, supposedly even holds them in quite high regard. A later Christian author even speculated that maybe Philip was secretly a Christian, which is nonsense. Later writers, who were largely clergymen, loved to retroactively Christianize people. The 250s are the decade that things start to rapidly go downhill for the Roman Empire, and therefore for Christians too. Like we said earlier, when everything was fine and dandy in the realm of the Caesars, no one really had the energy to make sure that literally everyone was sacrificing to Jupiter. But now that the Persian Empire had been reborn in the east, and a new confederation of Gothic tribes was assembling in the north, the Emperor Decius stared into the void of Rome's future. The trouble, so thought the deeply conservative Decius, was that Rome's people had declined in moral fibre, and in their duty to religio. Real, original idea, Decius, mate. You're certainly the first one to have come up with that one. So he tried to reintroduce the office of censor. This guy was in charge, amongst other things, of policing public morality. Decius then issued an edict, the first of its kind, ordering all of the empire to sacrifice to the gods for the good of the empire in front of a witness. The emperor, being a history buff like myself, wanted to reinvigorate Rome and drag her out of this new age of iron and blood back to the Pax Romana and the Antonine Golden Age. He even issued this cool little collector's edition coin set of all the deified Roman emperors. But most importantly, if everyone could please sacrifice to Rome's traditional gods, that would be great. Thank you. Of course, this caused a little bit of an issue on the ground level when it turns out that a small percentage of the empire would not commit idolatry. Here's the thing about Decius's persecution though, it looks worse in hindsight. Decius's agents weren't hunting down Christians per se, they were just trying to force everyone to sacrifice. A few church leaders flee, Origen is arrested and tortured, Pope Fabian is executed, but other than that, the number of Christians that die in this persecution seems kind of low. Those that died weren't executed for being Christian exactly, but for failing to show loyalty to the emperor and helping keep the empire safe by making sacrifice. Decius probably had it in him to go and hunt Christians down, but he dies after a very short reign. Yeah, how's that new golden age going, buddy? Sadly, this respite in persecution won't last long for the Christians. Valerian takes the imperial throne in 253, and 4 years into his reign, he sends a letter to the Senate. The letter gives orders that, much like Decius had wanted, Christians should be made to sacrifice to the gods to prove their loyalty. High-ranking Christians should be executed or exiled. Senators who... Wait, we have Christian senators now? Well, yeah, it seems over the last century, Christianity has gone from being a religion of slaves and women to one where the very upper echelons of society sometimes join in. Platonic philosophers are even dabbling in the religion and debating its merits, and wealthy Carthaginians like Bishop Cyprian are turning away from giving money to pagan temples and instead are giving to the poor. How times change. Well, I suppose that's what Valerian was scared of, because, like I said, the executions roll out fast and brutal with this one. Valerian's edict is basically the same as Decius's one, only much less forgiving. Cyprian, that bishop of Carthage who had given up his life as a wealthy Roman to become a Christian, is made to stand trial. He's asked to perform a sacrifice to the Roman gods, not to renounce Christ. Believing in him doesn't matter, remember. He just needed to take part in religio, his duty to the state. Cyprian says no, he's a Christian, and cannot, and so he is found guilty of living an irreligious life, and of declaring himself an enemy of Rome, her gods, and her emperor, and he is beheaded. The Pope in Rome and St. Lawrence are also high-profile victims of this short persecution. It would have probably gone on longer and been more brutal if the rule of Valerian, like that of Decius, hadn't met an abrupt end. In 259, Valerian becomes the first emperor in Roman history to be captured alive by a foreign power. His son, Gallienus, takes over the empire. One of the first acts of his chaotic reign was to end the persecution and restore the Christian places of worship. Clearly, Gallienus did not share his father's vision. And so another 50 years of peace for the Christians begins. Well, I say peace. Nothing about the years 260 to 300 were really that peaceful. But Christianity thrived and grew, as did many new cults and religions. Manichaeism, Mithraism, a renewed interest in oracles like that of Apollo, my old mate Serapis, who was always popular with the Egyptians, and most importantly, the worship of Sol Invictus. The Emperor Aurelian was not the first to try wrapping all of the confusing cults of the empire into one official religion with one supreme god, the sun, but he was the first to have some success in changing people's minds. I mean, it was hardly a revolution. Sol Invictus was an ancient deity with a pre-established cult in Rome, but it does show a change in Roman religious belief, what some historians call the trend towards monotheism. But all of that changed in 303. Diocletian, the man who had dragged a collapsing empire out of the swamp that was the 3rd century and rebranded it, was a big fan of bureaucracy, pragmatism, and oracles. For the first 20 years of his reign, you'd be forgiven for thinking he was sympathetic to Christians. He'd appointed many of them to high offices and allowed huge churches to be built in major cities throughout the empire. But something changed in 299. Diocletian had split the empire into 4, with 2 junior emperors and 2 senior ones. His junior emperor, or Caesar, a man called Galerius, shared with Diocletian a love for oracles. In the aftermath of a war with Persia, Galerius and Diocletian are waiting for the entrails of a slaughtered animal to be read, so that they can tell the future. But the priests can't figure out what the gods mean. They conclude that the presence of atheists are profaning the sacrifices, those in Diocletian's entourage who were making the sign of the cross during the rituals. Diocletian orders that any Christians in the military be discharged, but not killed. Not yet. In the autumn of 302, a similar incident occurred. Whilst making sacrifices in Antioch, a Christian called Romanus burst into the ceremony and denounced it as idolatry. Diocletian's mind has changed a bit over the last few years. Later sources will say that his time spent with his junior emperor, Galerius, who hated Christians, had turned the emperor away from his preferred policy of toleration. Diocletian ordered Romanus's tongue cut out and then executed him. He and Galerius then spend the winter planning their revenge. In the spring, without warning, imperial troops flooded the city of Nicomedia and stormed the church, taking everything of value and burning it down. The very next day, Diocletian issued an edict against Christianity, and it's a fairly sizable one, so here's the basic points. All churches should be burned down. Christian scriptures should be burnt. Any Christians of high rank should have that rank removed. Any freed slaves that had converted to Christianity should be re-enslaved. Christians lost the right to defend themselves in court, and they also lost the right to prosecute anyone in court. All of this was new. The Roman state had never targeted the base of Christianity before. They'd merely desired sacrifice. but Diocletian wanted to uproot Christianity forever and destroy any trace of its existence. It should be said that apparently Diocletian ordered this to be done without violence, but later Christian writers say that Galerius, the hate-filled subordinate, secretly encouraged the violence. However, the edict is met with immediate and unprecedented resistance from both Christians and some pagan sympathizers. The day the edict is first nailed to a wall, a Christian tears it down. Armed rebellions break out in the eastern provinces. Although we can't be totally sure how linked they are with the persecution of Christians, it's a bit of a coincidence that they happen at the same time. Worse than that, the imperial palace caught fire a few days after the edict was announced. Diocletian blamed Christians. Later, Christians accused Galerius of starting a little Reichstag fire to drum up further hatred against them. But it doesn't matter. The results were the same. More executions, and Diocletian editing his edict to emphasize the arrest of church officials. All of that good stuff that we imagine takes place in this year, 303. Throwing Christians to the lions, hunting for them. This is the most persecution-y persecution that there is in Roman history. It's not applied everywhere evenly though. In the West, ruled by Maximian and Constantius, barely any Christians die. Constantius is actually openly sympathetic to them, and a large number of high-profile Christians flee to his court, where he keeps them safe. The West was substantially more pagan, but also less keen on murdering its Christian minority. The persecution is undoubtedly one of the greatest failures of Diocletian's reign. His heirs, Galerius and Maximinus Dia, tried desperately to keep it going, but even the die-hard pagan Galerius, who had supposedly made it his mission in life to wipe Christianity out, couldn't do it. On his deathbed in 311, he issues an Edict of Toleration, admitting that the persecution had failed. 2 years later, the Edict of Milan would recognize Christianity as a religion with the right to exist. And so the tradition of pagans killing Christians comes to an end. From here on out, Christians will kill each other over minor doctrinal differences, and then take it upon themselves to start persecuting others. Such is the way of the world. So looking back on our Christian persecutions, it's hard not to see them as being, well, rare. I mean, we've covered 300 years of history here, and active state-sponsored persecution only seems to have existed for a year at a time here and there. There are even some persecutions that I haven't even bothered mentioning, because even though everyone's convinced that Marcus Aurelius, for example, persecuted Christians, I can't find any evidence in the ancient sources for this, other than a few times he said some not very nice things about them. In fact, the 4th century Christians, who write about all of this stuff, paint a picture of an empire that was hell-bent on their destruction, and of brave Christians going to their deaths knowing that redemption lay ahead in heaven. But this just doesn't seem to be the case. We know that the imperial authorities were not actually obsessed with destroying the worship of Christ. They only wanted to get people to perform that oh-so-important religio. Diocletian's persecution was the only one to really target Christianity at its source, and to try and destroy the religion once and for all. But it was too late by that point. This, of course, isn't to say that Christians weren't subject to discrimination. Just ask the Jews of Europe for the last 1,000 years how easily a people can turn on a community of outsiders, especially one with a different religion, with or without help from the state. But prior to the very last decade before Rome has her first Christian emperor, a persecution seems to have been little more than a request to please pour some wine on that stone there and keep our empire safe. Or I guess in the case of Nero, minorities always make great scapegoats. It's a good thing times have changed, hey. Thanks for watching.